We're going to talk Prove It Week. There's a lot of big games, and we'll talk a few of these others, but we're going to start with Notre Dame and Ohio State. Notre Dame right now outscoring their opponents by 34.2 points per game. Offense is 5th in yards per play, 9th in points per game. You got Sam Hartman's tied with Michael Penix, 4th in yards per attempt. We got a lot of really good stuff we've seen from Notre Dame. What are you looking to see from the Fighting Irish this weekend?
If they can protect Hartman, because when you just let him hang out there, some of the balls he threw against Central Michigan where no pressure, receiver just runs by a hapless MAC level safety. Can that translate against Ohio State? I think Notre Dame's offensive line has been good on the ground, very suspect in pass pro. And you just look at the numbers and think, well, how's that possible? They've only given up 4 sacks this year. But if you watch the games, there are definitely some holes in that line, especially in the interior, that concern me a little bit. And then, does Notre Dame get back to full health after they were down 3 starters and one of their top defensive line reserves last week? I believe they'll get 3 of those 4 guys back on Saturday at least. And if that happens, the defense should be able to tighten things up from, not a terrible performance against Central Michigan, but not nearly as crisp as what's going to be required on Saturday against Ohio State.
When you say terrible performance against Central Michigan, Pete, like what's that been like through 4 games here, trying to get a sense of kind of what's real and then what is Notre Dame doing things against, pretty inferior opponents so far on the schedule?
Yeah, it's complicated by, Navy. That's such a one-off opponent, Tennessee State, FCS, like you're not taking anything away from there. And like, I thought they actually played pretty well at NC State. Brendan Armstrong is not great, but he's, a legit Power 5 quarterback. They picked him off 3 times, put him under a bunch of pressure. I think Notre Dame's defense has been better than what I expected when the season started, but there's a big difference between that and like good enough to put the shackles on Ohio State. And to be fair, they did a nice job against Ohio State last year defensively, but so much of that had to do with they were basically trying to run a 4 quarters offense with Tyler Buchner at playing quarterback, trying to make that game as short and compressed as possible. They're not going to play that way on Saturday. So how does the defense hold up against a higher volume of plays? I think their secondary is really, really good. It's a good time to have great corners against Ohio State. But, do they stop the run? Trayvon Henderson, Ohio State's offensive line won that matchup last year. I think somewhat decidedly. The front 7 has to play a lot better than what they did last year over 4 quarters, I think.
If your dog wants to chime in, that's
always.
Totally okay.
Rosalind has so many takes on us.
just throwing them all up 4 weeks in. Yeah. Pete, when you look at the way that Sam Hartman has played, obviously just looking at the touchdown to turnover last night, 15-1 is pretty darn good start. How would you kind of evaluate not just like kind of what you expected going into the season versus kind of what you've seen the reality so far, but then also just the way he's influenced this team so far?
I mean, the influence part, I think, extends to the head coach. It extends to the defense. I mean, it's like you see Marcus Freeman get up in press conferences now, and he doesn't have to explain away what's going on in the offense. He's just like, man, that's really fun to watch. It's almost like he gets to be a fan for a hot second there, because just Notre Dame hasn't had a pass game like this in a long time. And, to see the quarterback hitting receivers in stride for touchdowns, there were games last year that they couldn't complete a 1-yard pass with Drew Pine. And then you see what happened in some of the other games this weekend with Tyler Buchner and Drew Pine and Phil Dracovic. And you're like, how did Notre Dame ever win a game? So Hartman, I just like the confidence that he exudes. I mean, you guys know him because he's been around forever. He just kind of has like this kind of dude mentality where you're just like, you look at him and you're like, that guy has it together. And he plays that way. And I think Notre Dame's offense and really the program at large is benefiting from it.
Yeah, I think you when you have somebody like that who's played at that level, and gosh, I think you've seen it just how clean he's played so far. I think it really elevates a team. Talking about Notre Dame with playing Ohio State, they obviously played last season or early in September. How different is this team than the Notre Dame team that faced Ohio State a year ago?
I mean, it's unrecognizable. I think, the head coach was in his second game. Now I think he's got 18 games in the bank. They've won 9 of 10. Like at that point, Marcus Freeman, not that he would come out and say that, but you'd be like, can I do this job? Like, am I good enough to be the head coach at Notre Dame? Like, and he came out of that game thinking like, yeah, probably, but we're not sure. Then they lose to Marshall the next week. But it's the quarterback just gives the whole program an uplift. And, now Ohio State actually has to defend Notre Dame opposed to just like, let's just put 12 guys in the box and see what happens. You can't play Notre Dame that way anymore. Like Notre Dame could really beat you one way last year. And that was good enough to win 9 games and move Clemson all over the field. But against a team like Ohio State, you got to have multiple paths to victory. And now Notre Dame has that offensively. So that is a huge difference from where they were a year ago.
Yeah, no question. I think that, I think that the timing of this one, you mentioned, I mean, that's just very early year one for Marcus Freeman a year ago. The timing of this one now, it's not just that Notre Dame has got 4 really nice performances under its belt, and you can argue they've been probably about as consistent as anybody in the games they've played so far. But we've seen just enough of Ohio State to maybe question them a little bit and just kind of wonder, have they put it all together yet? What are some things that, whether it's Ohio State strengths or Notre Dame weak spots or vice versa, what are some things that you look at in this matchup that you feel like actually this kind of sets up nicely for Notre Dame?
I mean, if you have the better quarterback and you're playing at home, those are 2 pretty big boxes to check. Notre Dame was at just an epic quarterback disadvantage last year. So to have that off the table, like all due respect to Bloomington, Indiana, but this is Kyle McCord's first road start. So that's part of it too. Defensively in the secondary, I think Notre Dame was maybe better than what I would have thought a year ago. Ben Morrison was a freshman All-American, but he was thrown onto the field against Ohio State and played pretty well. Now we know he's good. There are other starting corners. Cam Hart, who's 6'3", was a Bruce Feldman's Freaks List guy. He had a bad hamstring in last year's game, played through it, but wasn't himself. Now he's fully healthy. So I think having those 2 things in play where you're better at quarterback and you have good corners. I'm not saying they're going to lock up Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka, but you went into the game last year just sort of holding on for dear life against the pass. Now I feel like Notre Dame feels like that's a strength of the team. So those are 2 big changes from where Notre Dame was a year ago.
Yeah, when you talk about earlier Marcus Freeman, obviously you mentioned the early struggles last year, and there was a large narrative around, like you said, whether he could do this job. And obviously they recovered nicely to finish last season. They've started strong this season, and I feel like they've played fairly clean. When you look at this rematch, what does this game mean for Marcus Freeman and the vibe at Notre Dame in year 2?
Well, I mean, it means a ton for him on a personal level for the obvious reasons, playing at Ohio State. So that's part of it. Beating Clemson last year, I think sort of gave him a marquee win, even though, Clemson and Ohio State are not quite in the same group as maybe they were 2, 3, 4 years ago. So I think the question of like, can he do it or not has been answered. There's, I think, quite a bit of optimism. Like there were 2 things that Marcus Freeman brought that I think the fan base wanted to see or wanted to believe. It was like, one, they could recruit better. For the most part, I think that's happened. Maybe not at the levels that was expected. And then like, could you get up for big games in a way that Brian Kelly just never seemed to quite grasp that? I think the fan base felt like, all right, you beat every team that you should, but when it comes to Alabama or Georgia, you just can't quite get over that hump. And they did beat Clemson once with him. But, sort of like hitting that peak at a big game is something that I think Freeman has a chance to be very, very good at. So I think on Saturday night, this is going to be a big test of like, can you get Notre Dame to play above its talent level? Because if you just look at the roster side by side, Ohio State would be a clear favorite.
Pete, how long have you been on the beat now?
This is my 23rd year. So it's
23rd year. That's incredible.
Bob Davies' last year was my first year. It was a long time ago. think, 2001.
2001. Yes.
That's a long time.
I was a young child watching them play Nebraska around them. Was I?
Yes. Yeah, that's an angle for a story this week on the Athletic about how you keep the red out of Notre Dame Stadium, because if you remember that Nebraska game from 2000, which was so long ago, it was even before I was covering them. That stuck with a pretty big section of the Notre Dame fan base.
So I was going to ask you, in your wealth of experience, this is in your opinion, stakes and everything attached to it, biggest home game for Notre Dame since when?
2005 USC. It's not going to be bigger than that one, because that is still like the ultimate.
People still talk about that one.
Yeah, that's like, oh, it's time for a 30-year oral history on that. Now it's time for a 40-year oral history.
Every 5 years you got to redo
50-year oral history on that.
That's right.
The Clemson wins.
There's so many different ways to say he pushed him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Those Clemson wins 2020 and last year were big, but Notre Dame wasn't that good last year, so it's like the stakes for Notre Dame weren't as big. The Georgia game looks bigger in retrospect in 2017, but Georgia was 7-5 the year before. Notre Dame was 4-8. Like, is that really that big of a game? Stanford in 2012 was big, but it's Stanford, not Ohio State. Like, I think that the animosity for the opponent is different. It's like at a Michigan level. And like Ohio State is where Notre Dame wants to go. Like, they're sort of one of the models Notre Dame's trying to follow here. So it's kind of like, to be the best, beat the best cliche. And, Ohio State, that's a program that Notre Dame's fan base has like a very quiet animosity for. So this, to be able to win on Saturday and, sort of claim the Midwest for a week, I think would be very, very significant, not just for Freeman, but for the fan base.
What's the source of that disdain, would you say, if you're putting on your psychologist hat?
I think there's a little bit of the Urban Meyer dynamic there. He wanted to coach there, not at Notre Dame. I think Ohio State's fan base is quite loud. And if you're in the Midwest, they're kind of hard to miss. That's part of it. The recruiting battles, like Notre Dame doesn't win enough of those. If it's Ohio State head-to-head, like they won for Kingston Viliama-Asa, this 4-star linebacker from California this summer. Like, that was huge. And then the Marcus Freeman dynamic is a little like, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But let's say Notre Dame wins. How is the Ohio State fan base going to feel about Ryan Day? Who would they want after Ryan Day? Oh, okay. Well, maybe not. That's like, there's just a lot to it with Ohio State. And I think that Notre Dame hasn't beat them since 1936. They've lost 5 straight. It's their longest losing streak against any team in the country right now. There's just a lot there with it when it gets to Ohio State.
Very interesting.
Yeah, Pete, before we move on, one thing that you kind of brought up that I want to touch on, a little bit bigger picture for this program, is you mentioned, can they beat the teams above their talent level? And we know when Brian Kelly left, the ceiling that he hit could get to the playoff, couldn't win a national championship. I'm curious, just from your perspective, being on this beat so long, how achievable is breaking that ceiling, and what, I guess, how big of a albatross is that hangs over this program's neck?
It's big. It's hard as hell to be Alabama and Georgia and Ohio State with being a small Catholic school in the Midwest with high admission standards. Like, that's sort of the not to make a pun of it, but that's the cross Notre Dame bears, and they're willing to bear it. They want to be different, even if it makes it harder to get where they ultimately want to go. So it's, I don't know. I mean, Notre Dame, the fan base is peculiar that way, where they really, really want to win, but I almost more than they want to win their own way. They don't want to do it like Alabama does it, or Georgia does it, or Ohio State does it. And that's no judgment on that. But Notre Dame wants to sort of do it by its own rules. And how they navigate that is that's why covering Notre Dame is so fascinating, and probably why I'm still on this beat. Is just what other school in the country wants to win, wants to be an SEC school on Saturday, but an Ivy League school Sunday through Friday. It's a really weird dynamic. It creates a lot of sort of internal tension about like how committed you are to football, and Notre Dame pushes back about that. And so, yeah, it's just to get a game like Ohio State would be part of the like, hey, we did it our way vibe for the fan base. And the value of that, I think, would be massive for the program.